Hello, welcome, good evening. My name is Sue Hampel and I am the co-president of the Melbourne Holocaust Museum. And I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation as the traditional custodians of the land on which we are gathered. I pay my respects to their elders past and present. I would also like to pay my respects to the elders of our community, the Holocaust survivors, who are the inspiration behind our beautiful museum, which will be open to the public very soon. I am delighted that Melbourne Holocaust Museum is hosting tonight's event, and what a wonderful book to launch. Suzy is an exceptionally talented author, and for me it was a pleasure and privilege to work with her on her writing journey. You are all in for a great evening, and I'm looking forward to the conversation between Dr. Simon Holloway, the Manager of Adult Education and Academic Engagement at our museum, and Suzy. I'd now like to introduce Irma Gold, who will talk about Inkflower and give Suzy a proper introduction. Irma is an award-winning author and editor based in Naarm, Melbourne. Her debut novel, The Breaking, won or shortlisted for a number of awards, and her short fiction has been widely published in literary journals. Her acclaimed short fiction collection, 2 Steps Forward, and she is also the author of 5 children's picture books. Irma is co-host of the writing podcast Secrets from the Green Room and works full-time as a freelance book editor. She was also the editor on Inkflower. So I'd like to welcome you to the stage, Irma. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, Suzy Zail was an absolute joy to work with, and it is a joy to be able to introduce her and her stunning new book, Inkflower. Any of you who have read Suzy's books will know that she is an absolutely beautiful writer. Her sentences sing, her characters completely steal our hearts, and she knows how to tell a damn good story. I was very fortunate to work with Suzy on this book from the early development stages, which isn't always the case. And you never know if a good writer is also a good rewriter. They're actually 2 very different skills, and not all good writers are good rewriters. Suzy is both, and what she came back with after our initial conversations about how to structure and develop the book absolutely blew me away. I fell in love with the story immediately. This novel is truly something special. As its editor, I read this book over and over and over, and every time, without fail, it made me laugh and it made me cry and feel all the things in between. And that's what we want from fiction. We want to be able to travel in the characters' shoes and experience and feel what they are experiencing and feeling, and Suzy is so skillful at doing that. So we have the teenage protagonist, Lisa, and we feel all of the teenage feelings with her that at that age are so loud and intense, both the good and the bad. And then we have her father and his experiences in the Holocaust and with the illness that he is dying from. But I do want people to know that even though this novel focuses on the Holocaust and some very serious themes, there's light and shade in it. There's humour and joy, and ultimately the book is extraordinarily uplifting. So I really hope that it ends up on school lists everywhere. It should. But I also hope that adults read it. YA is really a crossover genre, so this book is for anyone from teens up, and I cannot recommend it highly enough to you. So let's hear more about it with Suzy and Dr. Simon Holloway.
Thank you, Irma. My name's Simon. As Sue mentioned earlier, I manage the adult education here at the Melbourne Holocaust Museum. But I'm also one of a small team of people who has the tremendous privilege of being able to deliver programs for school students here in the museum. And those of us who are engaged in this activity of educating high school students about the Holocaust appreciate that doing so is sometimes fraught with various complications. We walk, you might say, a fine line. On the one hand, we have an obligation to present the history as it was, an obligation not only to those who survived, an obligation to those who did not survive, not to whitewash the story, not to sugarcoat it in any respect. But on the other hand, we also appreciate that if students, if young adults encounter information that is confronting, if they encounter information that is distressing, that can preclude their ability to make meaning out of that information, And I'm saying this because in Suzy's new book, I think that Suzy navigates this line superbly. There is much within this text that is very confronting, but it is never distressing. Within this book, as Irma has just described, we read the experiences of Suzy's father. These are experiences that take him from a small town in Slovakia through various camps and tribulations and ultimately to Buchenwald within Germany. And along the way, Suzy is able to ensure that this is not confronting, both by means of her skillful narration, but also through her ability to periodically take the reader out of those events, taking them into the frame narrative in the present day, where we read the story of Lisa. Lisa, who is grappling with her father's mortality. Lisa, who is learning, as we are, as the reader, about the experiences of her father. And I would like just to read a few lines for you from this book, from fairly close to the beginning. Shortly after Lisa's father, shortly after Suzy's father, has begun sharing his experiences, in which he mentions various individuals who are members of his family, members, of course, of Lisa's family. And Lisa remarks, "I've never met my grandparents or my Uncle Willie until now. What am I supposed to do with them? I don't know these people. And it's their sad story, not mine. It's not even Dad's. It's too far back in the past, all of it happening to a boy I don't know, a boy with a yellow star and blood on his jumper, a boy who's climbing onto a truck headed somewhere bad." There is much within these pages that is traumatic, but it is never presented as the author's trauma, and as a result, it is never our trauma. And as a result of that, Suzy has succeeded in producing effectively a safe space for young adults to engage with an unsafe history. And really, in a lot of ways, the rarest of all things, an age-appropriate introduction to the Holocaust. Suzy, I want to thank you very much for allowing me the opportunity to be in conversation with you this evening.
I said I wouldn't cry, and I'm already like, oh.
Suzy, I wanted to start off by asking if you might share with us what were the actual circumstances under which you learned your father's story?
Actually, it's interesting because just a few days ago I was reading an article which said that often when people have trauma that they've hidden and not shared for many decades, it often takes a traumatic event for them to feel the need to share that. And that was really the case with my father when he was diagnosed with motor neurone disease in 1998 and given 6 months to live. And I remember, within a few days of being diagnosed, he called all of us, my brothers, my mum, all of our partners aside, and he said, "We are not going to spend the next 6 months crying, we are going to talk." And the first thing he wanted to talk about was his Holocaust story. So he flew all of us to Fiji, a deserted island in Fiji, and, over 9 nights, 25 hours, we heard his story. We would put our children to bed and we would go over to his little thatched hut on the sand, and we had the big chunky VCR recorder, we had dictaphones and scribbling notes, and he told us everything. He told us about being a young boy in a small village in Czechoslovakia, had no friends, being beaten up every day and chased off the soccer field. We heard about the Yellow Star, we heard about the cattle train trip to Auschwitz and his first experience seeing death. And I think my father hadn't told us these things because they weren't part of his life, his new life in Australia. He told us when he came to Australia in 1950, he got off that boat and he kissed the ground. And he saw around him smiling Australian faces, hawkers selling chocolates. And he said, the war was just a bleak time in history. It was an aberration. Look at these people. People are good and people are kind. And so I think he disconnected from the past as a way of moving forward, and he covered over his tattoo. He had his number A7639. He covered it over with a flower because he wasn't a victim anymore and he wasn't a number. But now, of course, he was dying and it was time to look back, and I think he realised that maybe we couldn't ever get to truly know him unless we knew what he had seen or what had been done to him and how he'd survived it. And so we came home from Fiji, and that 6 months turned into 5 years. And over that 5 years, I got to ask him questions. And the more I asked, the more he remembered. And the more I learnt about him, the more he learnt about himself, the closer we became. And I got to ask him questions that a daughter wouldn't never normally get to ask a father, like, what do you dream about at night? And what frightens you? And where did you first make love? And I think because I knew he wouldn't be around forever, I took the time to ask. And I think because he realised he wasn't going to be around for very long, he took the time to answer. And, you know, even when he could no longer speak, he had a tracheostomy tube, he would type away. He still had a little bit of function in his fingers, and he would type away his answers, you know, answers that really changed our relationship. And I remember in those 5 years just watching him live just so bravely and so beautifully whilst dying, and using that time as an opportunity to grow and like strengthen all his relationships. You know, my dad would always find a reason to get up in the morning, you know, when he could no longer talk. You know, he would type. When he could no longer walk, he would sit at the top of the stairs and say, I can still wait for the grandchildren to run up the stairs and throw their arms around me. He just always found a positive in it. And so I knew, watching him and learning from him, that there was two stories to tell. One was his Holocaust story and how he'd survived Auschwitz, and the other story was how he lived whilst dying, and how that changed us all. And I remember, you know, I was a lawyer. I had been a lawyer. My father's father had this dream for my father to be a lawyer. My dad had always wanted to be a lawyer, but of course Auschwitz got in the way. And so when I was deciding what to do, I became a lawyer. And I remember, you know, maybe it was a year before he died, thinking, I'm going to be a writer. I want to be a writer. You know, I found that I was just spending all this time with my dad, so curious. I just found I was really curious about people, you know, the tiny little details of their lives, and then having to reconstruct that on paper. And so I went to my dad, and I was so scared because, you know, he was so proud of me, you know, working in the city. And I just remember he could no longer talk. And I remember I went up and I told him, and he just smiled. So that was beautiful.
That is beautiful.
And then, sorry, I promised I wouldn't do this. And then it was the night before he died, and he was still at home. Mum had cared for him at home the whole time, and he was still at home, and we knew we were going to lose him in a matter of hours. And we all had time, each of us, alone with him in his room. And I remember climbing onto his bed, and I guess I just wanted him to... I had this image of him sort of floating away, and his arms and legs unfurling and, you know, shedding the disease. And I think I just wanted him to leave with a smile. And so I said, Dad, I promise you, your book is going to be on bookshelves, and everyone is going to learn from your experience and be moved. And yeah, he passed away that night. And of course I had made a promise I had to keep it. So I went back to uni to learn how to write, and a year later, The Tattooed Flower, which was the adult memoir, was published. And, you know, Dad wasn't here to see the book on bookshelves, but I kind of, every time I read a review and every time someone sent me a beautiful email, I kind of felt like he was right next to me, and he was like looking over my shoulder and reading it too. And, you know, he's probably here somewhere too and just loving it, because Dad didn't mind the spotlight. So, yeah.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much, Suzy, for sharing that. And I think the pathos that you've described here comes across so beautifully within this book as well. And so I have to ask, on what basis did you make that decision to fictionalize your account of how you had learned this information?
Yeah. So Dad told us his story in Fiji over, you know, 9 nights. We learned it in, you know, one chunk. And when I was sitting down to think about how am I going to write this for young adults, I thought, well, we were just so privileged to be flown to a desert island and to have, you know, 9 nights just focused on my father and the story. That's all we did. But that's not real life. You know, for most people, life gets in the way, and you don't get to hear stories like that. So I thought perhaps I can make it a bit more relatable too. And so structuring the book, so the father tells Lisa the story of Auschwitz over consecutive Shabbat dinners. So they get together for Shabbat, which they never had because Lisa's not really raised, you know, as a Jewish girl, and doesn't acknowledge her heritage really. So they start doing the Friday nights, and the father is telling her. And so what that allowed me to do is having the weekly instalments, which lasted over months, allowed me to have those weeks in between where you could watch how that story impacted Lisa and what that meant for her and how she resisted and how she fought against it and how she grew and how she stumbled and then she failed but she grew some more, and it enabled me to sort of teach those lessons, all about those things. So that was, I think, the main reason. And I got some really good advice too from my workshopping group who are here tonight, and it was because I felt guilty in a way straying at all from the tattooed flower, but they said you've got to free yourself from that story, perhaps maybe to tell a different truth or your own truth, and in a way that would be suitable for young adults, because that is the people that you want to learn from it.
Thank you. And you raise an interesting point, actually, Suzy, that in terms of how you had a sort of fictionalised that account, you'd also, in the process, created an alternate version of yourself, and effectively a version of yourself who was perhaps 20 years younger than you were when you first learned those experiences. What was that process like for you, of writing a different Suzy, who's an entirely different person?
Yeah, Lisa Suzy. Yeah. It was amazing. Well, first off, one of the very practical reasons is the first rule of writing for young adults is no adults as a main character. Kids do not want to read about a 32-year-old woman with a child. So that was a pretty easy decision. But, there's an exercise I actually give to students when I go to school sometimes, and I'll say to them, write down your deepest, darkest secrets on a bit of paper. And now give those secrets to someone else and write about them. And it's incredibly freeing when you don't have to write about yourself. I wasn't writing about Suzy, I was writing about Lisa. And so she was me. She had my, fears and my worries and my heart, but she was much more angsty. She was 16. She was much more conflicted about her father's story. She didn't want to hear it. She was angry at her father for dumping this horrible story on her and then leaving her and dying. She was conflicted about her own Jewishness. She didn't want to have to talk to her friends about being Jewish. None of them knew. And so it allowed me to explore all those things and some areas that I didn't have to do. And I think the other really lovely thing about fiction, as you'll know, Irma, is that you can direct the action. So I could get Lisa to do things that I was never brave enough to do. And so, when my father died, Mum will agree with me here, so my role was the scribe, and I would ask my dad questions and I would take down the story. But I didn't really do a lot of the heavy lifting in the way of, cleaning the feeding tubes and suctioning him. And I think I was scared. I don't know, maybe I was scared to see my strong father in that way. And so I kind of avoided it and, regret that now. But then I had Lisa on the page, and Lisa could push through those fears. And she could do the things, so I guess maybe Lisa's me, but braver in a way. And the other thing about writing a teenager is that there's nowhere to hide. So when you're writing a teenager, you have to feel all the feels. You have to approach the world like they do. And for teenagers, everything is huge and momentous and heartbreaking and awful. And so, I'd been raised to put up the walls just like my dad, and to sort of, just get on with things. If you've got feelings, you don't excavate those feelings, you deal with them on your own, you move on. The glass half full, you smile. And so really, I think I did that when my father died even. I remember thinking of him, as I told you, he was free now. He was free of his disease. And I remember when he died, I smiled. I felt happy for him and so proud of him. And I think even when I wrote The Tattooed Flower, looking back, I don't think I ever really grieved properly, because I had a job to do. I had to keep my promise and I had to write this book. And it was only when I sat down 18 years after his death, and I sat there and I thought, if I'm going to be a teenager, I have to feel this. And I just remember sitting at my desk and I just said to myself, how would it feel to be a 16-year-old and hear your father's dying and you don't even know him? How would it feel to find out you had this awful Jewish history and you don't know half your family? How would it feel to hear the story about a 13-year-old boy who's starving and scared and he's just lost his parents? And I just started bawling, like in a way that I actually had never done. And then I could feel the walls come up and I could feel myself going, come on, that's okay, you've done that now, so get on. And I just thought, no, I'm going to let myself feel this. And I let myself go and let myself become undone in a way that I hadn't done. So in a way, like, she was such a gift, I think.
It sounds, from the way that you were describing it, it sounds like it was a very therapeutic process for you to engage with this story. Do you think that's a fair description?
I think I just learnt so much about my dad, but also then so much about myself. And I mean, something I'd never come across was second generation trauma. I just thought, our family, we were so well adjusted. We were happy and smiling and we were great. And Dad was great. The Holocaust was then and, let's look forward. And, it's only when I sat down and actually thought about my fears in relation to the Holocaust and the things that I was reading about that I thought, there's something there. And I remember ringing, she's somewhere here, Irene Krauskopf, ringing her because she's done, I think, a PhD on it, and asking her questions and finding out that, you can carry that trauma in different ways,
Yes.
And so, it was really interesting and beautiful, yeah.
I want to come, if I may, to your father's experiences during the Holocaust, and actually, I'd like to read something again from your afterword in the author's note at the back of the book. Suzy, you've written that I've rounded out the facts and added dialogue and colour. My father only told us what he thought we could bear. He used the word hunger, not starvation, and death instead of murder. He never talked about being beaten or hopeless or hurt. And the reason I just wanted to read these lines out is, of course, when we read this book, we do read accounts of your father's being beaten. You'd obviously had to make the authorial decision to include those passages where appropriate. I wonder if you can comment a little bit more on any other changes that you might have made, anything that you've used to give depth to a story that was your father's.
I think it's interesting. I think when you think about the past, it's often incomplete, and there are often gaps, especially when the person that's telling you the story wants there to be gaps and talks very fleetingly about certain members of the family, certain horrific events, because they're protecting themselves, because they want to protect you, because I think my father believed that to be a good father, his job was to protect us from the harsher realities and teach us to be hopeful and positive and all those things. And so I think that, yes, I had to imagine a lot of the things because my father didn't provide them and make these characters 3D. So my father would say things like, in relation to, he had a brother that passed away, that died, was murdered in the Holocaust, and brother Willie. And we always knew that Willie existed. Gary was named Gary William Braun, but we didn't know much more. And my father had only ever told us in those 9 nights that Willie had stolen food for me in the camps. He had dragged me through the death march. He saved my life many times. We're very close. And then he died, and that was it. But of course, in fiction, you can't summarise. And I wanted people to feel that gut punch when you find out Willie's died, because you love Willie and you love that relationship. And so I had to make it up because, there were no photos of Willie, there were no letters between my father and Willie. My father was no longer here to tell me. I had so many questions, was Willie cheeky? Was he serious? Was he a goofball? What games did you play? I couldn't ask any of those questions, and so I had to make that up. But going off what my father had said, but it was so beautiful because I'd never met this man. He died one day before liberation, and I felt like I'd spent 2 years on the page with him. I felt like we were friends, and that I knew him. And there were other beautiful scenes which were just such a joy to write. Like there were scenes where my father, when he was young, was having Shabbat dinner, Shabbat lunch with his mum and dad, who, of course, we never met. They were killed in Auschwitz. But I was in the room there baking challah with Mama. And then when my dad was reunited with the siblings that had survived, my dad told us in Fiji, I reunited with my siblings. That was the story. That was it. 9 nights seems like a long time, but when someone's telling you a lifetime of stories, it's nothing. So to be in that room, to create that room and be in that room with my brother's siblings and have them see each other for the first time and find out they're alive, and their eyes, bulging, and they're rushing at each other and hugging each other and crying and laughing and not letting go. It was like I was there with them, and it was just beautiful.
And I think that also really highlights one of the beautiful things about fiction, in that you were therefore able to give these people life, that those people who, like your father's parents and like his brother who perished, they feel real within the pages of this book. I would love in a moment actually to take questions from people who are here, but before I do, and before I ask if anybody has any questions that they would like to ask Suzy, I'd also like to know if in the process of researching this book, if there were any interesting discoveries that you made, anything that you found out after your father had since passed away.
I mean, there were lots. I did a lot of research, and I always think that, you know, even though I've done 4 books set in Auschwitz, the part of that second-gen trauma, I think, that you've got to do the work and read. So there was a lot of research, but I think particularly, sorry, I've just lost the question. Remind me.
Anything interesting that
yes,
you've
surprise.
discovered, anything that you found out?
There was lots of things. I remember rereading Elie Wiesel's Night and stopping at a page and realising that my dad was 74 people away from Elie Wiesel waiting to get a tattoo, you know, things like that. And then also Robbie, who works at the Holocaust Museum, unearthed a video that we had never seen of my father. And so 18 years after he died, I got to see him talking and laughing and crying. He came to the museum and he gave his testimony. He probably felt it was something he should do, didn't tell us. Although I asked my mum and she said she remembered him coming home after and saying, this was in the 80s, I'm never doing that again. And so seeing my dad up there and telling the story in quite a different way than he told us. You know, he was emotional, he was teary, and when he told us the story in Fiji, he was unemotional. It was almost like he was on the outside looking in. And again, I think it was part of that, I've got to get through this. And so he was, you know, he put the walls up again to some respect. But to see him really feel those things, and it was very emotional. And
if you don't mind my asking, in watching him share his account here at this museum, did he share any information that he hadn't told you?
Oh yeah. He talked about murder. Well, for us, he talked about death. He talked about starvation. For us, it was hunger. He talked about things like being beaten. But it was mainly the way he described himself. They asked a really good question. They said, "Tell us about the boy who went into Auschwitz, and tell us about the boy that came out." He was 13 at the time, and he said to them, the boy that went in was this scared, shy, insecure, frightened shell of a boy, and the boy that came out was angry. Well, my dad had never described himself as a shy shell of a boy. You know, it was great, you know, his best friend was his goat, and he loved his brothers and sisters. It was all kind of focused on hopefulness and the beautiful stories, even though he told us some of the less beautiful stories. So seeing him tell that truth, you know, it was quite amazing. And, you know, I was thinking about even the way that I write. I don't shy away from making my readers feel things really deeply. I always think it's the biggest compliment if my readers cry. It sounds really horrible, but I love when you cry. But, you know, and yet my father, I've lost my train of thought again. I'm getting all emotional about it. But it was very emotional. So no, what I was going to say was that even though I like people crying, I am, like my father, very protective of my readers, and I'm always very careful to also shield them from any graphic detail, and I take a lot of care in how I tell the story, because I guess, like my dad, I don't want to thrust them into a world that they aren't ready for or can't deal with. Yeah.
And I think that's actually a really important distinction, because it is a very emotional text, but it's always an emotion because you feel something for these people, not because you yourself are distressed in encountering this information. And I think that's something that that comes across quite beautifully within it. I have other questions I would like to ask, but I also appreciate that there may be people here with questions that they would like to ask of Suzy as well. And I'll ask at this point if there is anybody here. I'm going to squint into the darkness who has a question. I see a hand over here. Thank you, Maya.
Have you now delivered, and are you free of that promise, or is there more you feel you need to tell?
You know, it's a great question, thank you. Is this working still?
No.
One overrides the other.
Talk too much, that's why. I have to project.
One overrides the other.
Yeah, it's really interesting because I was thinking about why I keep returning to the story, and why 18 years after writing the story, I felt like I had to go back to the same story that I'd written. And I kind of worked out, I think that, thank you, that I'm driven to a large extent, I think, by fear and by this sense that even though I didn't grow up under the cloud of the Holocaust, I grew up under a rainbow. And my dad, as I said, didn't talk about it. And yet there was always this sense that it wasn't safe to be a Jew. Even now, when I meet people, I don't tell them I'm Jewish until they know me. And, I think that, I was scared of what happened to my dad as a child, and I was angry. And I think, what do you do with all that fear and anger? I mean, revenge is nice, but I think change is better. And who better to target than young adults who are still kind of trying to work out, who am I? What sort of world do I want to live in? And so, I think I keep being driven by that. And maybe in some ways I'm trying to transform everything I'm carrying into something beautiful and something healing, kind of like my dad did, when he covered over his ugly tattoo with a beautiful flower. And even with motor neurone disease, I don't know how, but he managed to turn it into something so beautiful. And so I think that fear drives me. With all my books, whether they're about disability, racism, gender equity, I think it's just trying to affect some change. And I kind of think Dad would be really happy to know that his story was the gateway, even to some small bit of movement towards maybe creating a world that's safer for everyone. So I'm not sure. I don't think I'm finished. I might be finished with this story, but I think it's always going to be about that. Yeah.
Thank you, Suzy. And that was a beautiful question. Thank you. I saw there's a hand here in the front row.
Just very quickly, Suzy, I just, as you were talking, I had a recollection of your father, my father, and I was a young woman in my 20s, 30s, thank you, building a house, and your father was on the council, the corporate council, and they had rejected the plans for this house, and my mother said, "Oh, why don't we contact your father?" And we did, and he listened to everything and he formed an opinion, and because of his help we were able to build the house that we wanted and that was fair to our neighbours and everything. And just quickly, I had this recollection of him. I think he was an amazing man in many ways. Just quickly, a question: have I missed my time? Am I hogging? Okay. Did you have, and if this is too personal, I accept that as well. Did you have any objection from your siblings, from your mother? Was it a difficult journey that, from your perspective, telling this story? That's my question.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. It was really interesting because, I think we all had a role, and my mother's role was to love and care for my father, physically kept him at home for the whole 5 years. My brothers were both doctors, and they made sure that my dad had absolutely the best care, that he was always comfortable. And so I guess this is what I did. And they were all so incredibly generous because I'm fictionalising. There's fact and fiction, and Gary and Peter haven't read about themselves yet, but they are. I think Gary's the rock god, the 80s rock god, and Pete's the preppy boy with the polo shirts, with a collar up. But they were just incredibly generous in allowing me to reimagine this story, and especially my mum, because, there's a chapter just about their love affair and how they fell in love, and I asked her lots of questions too, and it was beautiful to hear about that and be able to write that and be there the first time my dad held my mother's hand after 18 dates. So they were very, very generous, and and memory is fallible, and my memories are not going to be their memories either. And I think my brothers told me that my father talked a little bit more to them about the Holocaust. I think during Yom Kippur they used to go for a little walk, and just a little bit, where he didn't tell me anything. And I don't know if that was because I was the youngest or I was the daughter, but so we'll have different memories, but I hope they enjoy it.
Thank you, Suzy. I'm going to be sneaky and actually get in with another question, because, Suzy, you mentioned the fallibility of memory, and am I correct in understanding you may have also learned some things after the fact, while researching your father's story, that perhaps he himself had also forgotten?
Yeah, I'm going to bring the mood right down now. One of the things that we did find out after my father died, my father had always said I was the youngest of 5. That's how the story started in Fiji. That's how the story started when I watched that video, you know, the testimony, and that was how it always was. Well, after my father died, we actually found out that he wasn't the youngest of 5. There were actually 2 little brothers. One was 3 and one was 9. And my father would have been incredibly close to them because his siblings were all a lot older and were off at school in a different city. His mother worked, his father worked, and he would have been the one that cared for them and played with them, looked after them. And we found out, you know, that of course when they went to Auschwitz, they were young and they would have gone straight to the gas. My dad had, I believe, totally wiped their memory, repressed them so deeply he didn't even know they existed. And it just, you know, it really, when we found out, it really saddened me to think, I mean, on so many levels, that he had felt that he had to bear it all on his own, that to be a good father, that he had to be, you know, strong and smiling at all times. And the saddest thing, I think, was that no one remembered these boys, you know. My father hadn't remembered them. Hitler had tried to get rid of them. When I did the research, initially I really wanted to let these children have space on the page. I had this dream that we would have 2 blank pages and they would just have their names and their dates of birth, almost like a tombstone, because they weren't buried. I just wanted to have this air and this space around them. And these boys existed. They lived and they died. I had very good advice that I shouldn't do that in this book because that is a huge story, and to try and put that in 1 chapter just wasn't going to do it justice. But when I did my research, I actually found out there were, because I wanted to know, well, I wanted to have absolute dates of their births and their deaths. And of course there was no death certificate because when people were sent to straight to the gas, they weren't registered. They were only registered if they worked, so there was no death certificate. I was hoping for birth certificates because there was some dispute about their ages. There was no birth certificates. So in the little village where they lived, the town scribe or the town council actually burnt all the records so the Nazis wouldn't know who was Jewish and who wasn't, which is quite beautiful. But yeah, that was a pretty awful story. And it just made me think no one gets out of the Holocaust without scars. My dad appeared to, but no one does.
Thank you very much for sharing that with us, Suzy. And I think although you made the decision not to include their stories within your text, there is so much within this book that hints at all of those untold stories there in the margins of the page, those people who are part of the background who did live and breathe, and such is the nature of that tragedy.
And you all know they existed now, so that's nice.
Does anybody else have any questions to ask Suzy at this point? I see another hand over here.
Suzy, look, obviously congratulations. I commend you on the courage and the love that it must take to have written a book of this nature. You talk about writing for younger people, and I continually am reminded of my own age when I'm trying to deal with graduates in the office. How do you test if you're hitting the mark when you're writing? That, like, you might feel and sit as if you're writing it through the eyes of a young person, but it's such an endeavour. You obviously want to make sure that you're on point. How do you do that?
I think first of all, as a writer, by losing yourself in the role. I mean, I was Lisa, and in some ways I think I've never really grown up, and I actually think I am emotionally and mentally 16. My kids would agree with that probably. And so I can only do my best at that. And then you have brilliant editors and you have brilliant friends who workshop your work every week, and they read it and they tell you, I don't believe this, or you can do better than that. And they make me work harder. And so I have lots of sets of eyes on it before it ever gets published. And so that's why you need smart people, who write themselves and who are happy to be honest and tell you when stuff's just not working, and make you think harder and work harder. And then it goes to schools, I guess, and kids read it and you hope that it resonates, and sometimes you hear from them, and that's always fantastic. Yeah.
Thank you, Suzy. I am mindful of the time, but I would like to ask one more question before we bring this part of the evening to a conclusion. And in relation to the question that was just asked, I wonder if there's a particular message within this book that you really hope readers will take out of it.
There's this author called Richard Powers, and he said once, I'm trying to remember it, he said something like, the best arguments in the world won't change a single mind, only a good story can do that. And so I really hope I've done that. The lessons that I want to impart, which I hope are obvious, threaded throughout the book, are things that my dad taught me, things that I learnt, and things like celebrate today. So like I told you, my father, when he could no longer feed himself, he said, that's okay, I can swallow, I can still taste food. He constantly said, celebrate today. Things like, don't let other people's opinions stop you from doing the things you want to do. So, you know, when my dad, towards the end, he was in a wheelchair, he had a feeding tube, he had a tracheostomy, he had suctioning material. And I remember he would come to my children's concerts and he wouldn't sit at the back. He would get mum to take him right to the front where he didn't care who could see him. He wanted to see his grandchildren sing and dance, you know. So that was a big lesson. And I think also that small acts of kindness and friendship can be hugely powerful. That's mainly for lessons from the Holocaust. And, you know, sometimes I think, you know, as a writer, my best weapons are words, but I write books, a few people will read them. What am I really doing? And I've thought about it. I think a better way to look at it is, I'm just one person, but what about if 1 million of us did one small thing? Think about what we could do, you know. So much, you know, sharing your fears shrinks them. There was just so many things. I'll leave it to the book to speak for me. But
Your father sounds like he was a wonderful person.
My dad.
Yeah. Suzy, I want to thank you so much for sharing your time with us this evening and allowing me to have this conversation with you. Thank you.
thank you. Thank you so much. I just wanted to say just a very, very quick thank you to the people that helped me write the book, just very quickly. Irma, if anyone's writing books, best editor ever. Thank you so much for, she made me work hard, and yeah, the book's so much better for it. I wanted to thank Sue, who was my expert reader. You know, when you're mixing fact and fiction, it's just really important to get it right. And Sue helped me by going through it and saying everything that's there could have happened. Yeah, so that was just so valuable. Everyone at the Holocaust Museum who's been amazing, Maya and Jane and everyone here. Simon, as soon as I watched Simon do an interview with someone a few months ago, I have to have Simon. He's just smart and brilliant. And if I stuff up, I knew that he'd carry it.
Thank you, Suzy.
Yeah, and to my workshopping group who made the book so much better as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Folks, I'd like to thank everybody here for coming this evening. Before we do a head out to partake of the food and the drink and to grab copies of this book, I did just want to announce just a few things that are actually coming up here at the Melbourne Holocaust Museum in the near future. On the 25th of July, Sue is going to be giving a lecture here. She's going to be applying the lens of gender to the Holocaust, looking at the experiences of women during the Holocaust. On the 6th of August, Sunday the 6th of August, we have a Holocaust survivor here, Sarah Saroni, the lady to whom Suzy was just referring. She's one of our wonderful survivors, and she's going to be sharing her experiences here. And then on the 15th of August, I'm going to be giving a lecture here on Jewish theological responses to the Holocaust, both during the Holocaust and in the years since then. And I hope very much to see your faces at those three events. In the meantime, thank you again very much for coming out this evening, and I look forward to seeing you in the other room.